Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're watching. Thank you for tuning in for another episode here of the Amazic podcast. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazic, and I want to encourage you to head over to the website amazic.com, amazic.com. That's where we post all of our uh, interviews, event coverage, articles, job listings, a whole bunch of things that you'll really find very interesting if you're in the space of cloud native and Kubernetes, because that's what we really talk about. That's what we focus on. And today as well, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about cloud native and Kubernetes. And I have with me Andy Suderman, who is the CTO at Fairwinds. So really excited to talk to him today. Andy, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So to get us started, Andy, could you tell us a bit about your background and what you've been up to before Fairwinds?
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's lots of quippy little things we like to say about, our former careers or how we got to where we're going. But I really started in computers at a young age. My dad was an IT director at his company, and we started out building networks across the house to play StarCraft 1. And that's how I learned how to build networks. Got to learn the IPX protocol, which nobody uses anymore. And that's really where I started. And yeah, kept that interest through high school. Did some odd jobs here and there working in computers. And then I actually went to college to get a mechanical engineering degree because I really enjoyed mechanical engineering and I liked that side of things. And I got out of school and realized that jobs were much more common in the software world. So I took my networking skills and went and did some things on my own for a while, but really ended up being a sysadmin for quite a while. I did that for years. I was a Windows admin for a while, and then a Linux admin, and then at a company in Denver called ReadyTalk, I got introduced to Kubernetes, and that was probably about we're pushing on 7 or 8 years ago at this point when I got introduced to Kubernetes, and it really it made things so much easier for all the stuff that we were doing at ReadyTalk, and I really wanted to keep doing it. So my next job, I went and found a company doing only Kubernetes, and so I landed at ReactiveOps, which is the former name of Fairwinds, and started out running clusters for our managed service clients. So I was an SRE that got to serve 6 or 7 different clients, run dozens of clusters over that time. And that was 5.5 years ago. And since then, Fairwinds has grown the managed service. We've built software over the last 4 years, our Fairwinds Insights product. And throughout that, I've just been involved in the process from beginning to end. And so now I find myself all the way at the top as CEO or CTO, sorry. And I get to do different things, but still it's all Kubernetes all the time and open source. So that's kind of the quick version of my story.
Really cool, really cool. Great journey there. And yeah, I was curious to know about Fairwinds and just how it slots into the market because sounds like, there's a bunch of different things it touches on. Because I was looking at the website and I saw that there's a lot of focus on cost reduction and there is a focus on automation and there's also a bit of security and governance. So I was wondering, how these different kind of use cases, but then how would you, how do you describe Fairwinds? Where does it fit in the marketplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get that a lot, right? Because we do cross a lot of different pieces that people would typically keep separate. And, I think a little bit of history is helpful here, right? We started out in managed service. So we're running clusters. That's all we're doing. We have open source that we use to do that. And so we saw the potential to turn that into a product. And so we said, okay, what are the things that our customers are breaking in our clusters, right? Because when we have a cluster outage, it's not usually because we broke something. It's because our customers deployed something into our cluster. And so that's where the idea for Insights and Polaris came from. 4 or 5 years ago, the idea was really just an admission controller with some basic policies, which 5 years ago, nobody was doing that. Now we have several different policy engines and things like that. So we've evolved over time. And, as we got good at that and other solutions came into the market, we realized that security is a tough space to compete in, first of all, from just a pure business perspective. and that nobody was really doing much around cost. And so we started working, with the FinOps Foundation. We got involved with that. We learned about costs. And so I'd say one of our primary focuses these days is about right sizing and cost. But we keep the policy and governance piece alive and well, and we keep working on that, because I don't think you can do cost management and allocation and chargeback and all those good things without having some policy and governance on top of that to enforce the different policies around cost. And so we
Mhm.
do still play both in the governance and policy area as well as the cost area. But I would say, one of our biggest focuses, especially with the macroeconomics of the world over the last year, we have definitely focused in on cost as a major functionality of the software. So if I had to pick one thing, it would be cost.
Interesting. And I'm guessing you probably have seen a huge uptick in interest for this because over the past year or year and a half, there's been a lot of, I think, budget cuts across company, a lot of layoffs and all of that with the economic situation changing. Would you say that's true? Have you seen a lot more focus on costs in the recent year?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just at KubeCon in Chicago. What was that? About a month ago at this point, and I think there were probably, you know, 4 times as many cost vendors or cost related projects out there than there were just 2 or 3 years ago. I think 2 or 3 years ago, we were all just still trying to we were really still trying to figure out how to use Kubernetes, or a lot of folks were.
Mhm.
And that's still the case, but those who have adopted it heavily are definitely much more focused on costs over the last year.
Interesting. So yeah, since you focus on costs, you've probably seen a bunch of different ways that costs can really spiral out of control. Could you tell us a bit of maybe some of the horror stories or some examples that probably drive the point home that costs are an issue that you need to pay attention to? What have you seen out there?
Oh, that's great. There's a ton of different ones. I think the more fun ones are the ones that I've done by accident. So I was working on building a cluster to do one of the things we're working on is automated right sizing, and we could talk more about that later. But I was using Carpenter, which is an intelligent cluster autoscaler. It'll just give you a node size, whatever you want. Well, I had also turned on a vertical pod autoscaler for a particular workload. I think it was Insights or Ingress Engine X actually, and vertical pod autoscaler it doesn't work so well until you have a critical mass of data. And so it's well known that in the first startup of vertical pod autoscaler, it can recommend some very wild resource usage. Um, and so I believe Carpenter very happily handed me I think C24XL in Amazon to run this pod because it thought it needed 14 CPUs or some giant number. And I was like, oh man, if I hadn't noticed this and I just left this running, very easily would have gotten into a situation where my cluster was costing 10 times what it should have, just because of one small configuration difference or one piece of missing data. And I think there's a ton of opportunities to do that in Kubernetes, right? Super easy to say, I need 64 gigs of RAM because that's what my MacBook has. And so my pod needs that. And we deploy that into the cluster. And if we don't have, policies and controls around that, or, at least some visibility into it, it's very, very easy to do that sort of stuff.
Wow, wow, very interesting. And what would you say are some of the warning signs that people should probably pay attention to, which they might be neglecting otherwise, thinking that's normal, but actually you need not be, I mean, it's a sign that you're overpaying and you need not be doing that. What are some of those warning signs?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the first one for most folks in any organization is if you have no idea what your Kubernetes cluster is costing you, it's probably over provisioned and you're probably paying too much. Like if you have nothing in place, if you're not checking your AWS bill, or you're not, keeping some sort of eye on that, then odds are good you're over provisioning, because it's really easy to do. We don't make it super simple to to keep the cluster, at a very optimal size. Um, Another one I think is cluster proliferation. If you have more than, a handful of clusters, except in the largest environments, that's probably a sign that you're over provisioned as well, because Kubernetes is good at what? Bin packing, right? Like it's supposed to take all the pods and put them together. Well, if you create 12 different clusters, you just created an artificial boundary where you can't bin pack anymore. And so unless you have a logical business reason for having that many clusters, there's a good chance you're overspending on Kubernetes if you have more than a small handful of clusters.
Interesting. I'm kind of thinking of it from like the person managing Kubernetes from their point of view. And, one of the concerns I think would come to their mind is, what if I break something trying to reduce costs? And that's obviously like the worst thing. They don't want that, and that would prevent them, and change is uncomfortable, change sometimes is costly. And they don't want to, open that can of worms and think about how can I reduce costs? What do I remove? How can I what would you say to someone who is, thinking that got that on their mind? If I'm going to reduce costs, I'm going to break something, so let me just leave it. What would you tell them?
That's a good question. I mean, there's always the depends side of it. The question mark is, why are you trying to reduce cost, right? If you don't have a business mandate to reduce costs, then maybe stability is the trade-off that you're making, and you don't make those changes, right? Maybe that's the right thing to do. But if your goal is to reduce costs and you're scared of reducing costs, which I think is common, I think it's a good point. First of all, I think one thing that we still lack in a lot of companies is proper load testing. We haven't gotten good at building a staging environment and then actually running load tests against that on a regular basis. And so it's very, very hard to feel comfortable making changes to your resources in production if you can't test that out in a non-production environment. So that's one particular area where I think we can, make things better. I know, K6 by Grafana is a great load testing tool that I've used. Their open source is great. They have a paid offering as well. Relatively straightforward to use. I think, we have a fairly hefty load test that runs every night against our staging environment so that we have those metrics to look at and say, this is safe to run in production, or we think it is. The second thing is having good indicators of performance in production. So as you make those changes, you have quick feedback to know, is this impacting my application and can I fix it, right? We should be watching for, large amounts of CPU throttling. We should be measuring our golden metrics to make sure that those changes were safe and we can roll them back quickly if they do make a mistake. So a lot of it comes back to, just general safe software development and deployment practices that will enable you to get through this process.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds, yeah, I think you framed it really well there with those two focus areas. I want to touch upon something you mentioned a little earlier, which is that, you connect cost reduction with security and with policies, and they're kind of inseparable. And I want to just dig into a little bit more on that theme because, talking about cost reduction and these other very related aspects. I saw as well on your website, talking about reducing the cognitive load on developers or the platform team. So could you talk more about that? Uh, how are they related? How is reducing costs related to having a simpler Kubernetes stack with reduced cognitive load, or maybe a more secure Kubernetes stack with better policies? How are these things related?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for us, it's really about the way I like to frame it, and the reason that we need policy and the reason that I think it's important is because Kubernetes by itself, the defaults are terrible. I mean, we can be frank about that, right? The default, if I just go kubectl create a deployment, right? The default deployment that I get doesn't have any of the things that I need to be production ready or secure or efficient. And so as a developer coming into Kubernetes for the first time, if I put my developer hat on, I wrote some software, I'm ready to deploy it. If my platform team says, okay, go learn how Kubernetes works and write a Kubernetes deployment, what am I going to do? I'm going to create the bare minimum deployment and I'm going to deploy it, and we're not going to have any of those defaults. And then my security team comes to me and they say, oh, well, you can't do that. So now I have to go learn about Kubernetes security, and I have to go learn about how CPU requests and limits work and all of these things. And so if as platform teams, we build clusters up front that have these defaults built in, along with a set of, whether it's documentation or a blessed Helm chart or however you want to orchestrate this, or templates for folks to use, if we give them these defaults out of the box and then we enforce them at admission time, or we have good feedback mechanisms into our CI/CD, we make it so that the developers don't have to go out and find this information or get slow feedback loops. We make it so that this information is right in front of them, where they're developing, where they need it, or in some cases, we've just removed the need for that, right? If we create a default deployment that doesn't run as root, it's pretty straightforward to write a Docker file that works in that mechanism. And so you don't spend a lot of time going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You have all these defaults in place up front. So as a developer, the cognitive load is less, and I get into the environment faster, which then leaves me time to do things like write load tests and do profiling on my containers so that I can run them more efficiently, or spend time working on features, heaven forbid. So that's good. That's the way I think about it.
All right, interesting. Well, so I want to segue into talking about Fairwinds itself, and what does Fairwinds do and its approach to all of this. We kind of described the challenges, we described even the solution to these issues, and I want to talk about just Fairwinds' approach and how this all comes together.
Yeah, I think this might be a good time to jump into a little bit of a product demo to start showing if
right.
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's some things here that will answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure I grab the right screen here. All right, are we seeing that? Yep.
Yeah.
So if we take a look at Fairwinds Insights and we go to my first tab here, we're going to see that we can pull in any number of clusters we want here. So this is actually my R&D environment that I work in. We have an ops cluster and a sandbox cluster. And so we can see things across all of the clusters that gives us information about them. And what we do is we install and run a bunch of different open source. So we have our open source, we have some best-in-class open source. If we go here, we can see sort of the list of all the things that we integrate with. So we've got our open source again, Pluto, Nova, Polaris. We've got policy. We have multiple policy agents that we support because Polaris is a policy engine, OPA is a policy engine. We're working on, we have some Caverna support at this point. We're pulling in Trivi for vulnerability scanning. And what all of these tools do is they look at either clusters or Kubernetes deployments, and they tell you information about them, whether it's security information or policy information or right sizing information. And what we do is we normalize all of that information into what we call an action item. And so I can go look across all of my clusters and see all the different action items across all these different reports. If I just want to see, the Polaris policy violations, I can see those here across every one of my clusters. Now, this is sort of a fire hose of information. We don't need all of this, but we need this base level of information in order to act on it in the same way across all these different things that we do. And so we have action items related to efficiency. If we think you need to resize your container, we'll give you an action item. If we think you need to stop running as root, we can create an action item for that. And then from there, we allow you to do lots of different things with that action item. So we have automation rules that allow you to say forward that action item onto a specific Slack channel. So we can say if it belongs to this team and has this label, send it to their Slack channel. Or we have our repositories integration where we can say, all right, every time there's a PR on this repo, surface these specific sets of action items in that PR in CI/CD right there. And then the last thing that I think we talked about quite a bit in our approach here is we want to give developers information on how to set their resource requests and limits quickly. And so with our Prometheus integration, we can go to, say, our top workloads report here. We'll see that our top workload is Nginx Ingress. We can go down here and start to see, oh, hey, look, this particular workload here in the sandbox cluster, we think we can save $20 by right sizing that. Or maybe, I'm a developer and I've actually only been given access to my namespace, and this happens to be my namespace. I can click into that particular workload and see for the last 30 days, how much has it been using? What's the average usage? What's the max? And then here's my recommendation for how we can right size that container in a way that is safe because we take into account the maximum, but also will save us a decent chunk of money. I mean, this is a small cluster, small environment, but That's not a small amount of money added up across a lot of workloads across a lot of time. So we really try to put this information in all the places that it might need to go and give platform engineers the tools to route that information where it goes.
Mhm. Very cool. So this recommendation, for example, you could route this to Slack, this itself, is it, to the concerned team? Is that how it would typically work?
Yes. So this would have generated an action item, and we can actually see here the action items associated with that pod. And so I can write an automation rule that takes this container should be right-sized action item and sends it off to the team where it needs to go. We can also create a Jira ticket from that. I could actually go in here and just create a Jira ticket and route that straight to the team that it needs to go to. I could also write an automation rule that automatically routes this to a Jira ticket. And then we can also just assign them straight in the platform. So I could assign this to our tech lead, Stevie, here and say, hey, can you go right size this for me?
Really neat. I like the automated rules. I think it really would make things a lot easier, especially as you build them up over time, right? You add more rules and you tweak them, add those slight variations. I think it could really be a big time saver, don't you think?
Definitely, definitely. We have some customers that have some very complex rule sets because they have, 60 clusters or so, and they've got, 20, 30 different teams. And so they have some very complex rule sets to say, this combination of labels and these action items get grouped together and sent to this team specifically to help them, improve their Kubernetes stance, um, you know, pretty quickly. And so there's definitely a lot of power in the automation rules.
Interesting. I was wondering if you could show us a security use case. I see vulnerabilities as one of the subsections there.
Yeah, so this is probably one of our primary pure security use cases. And that's really just tracking vulnerabilities, reducing vulnerabilities in your clusters. And so since I have all clusters selected up here, I can see, that this particular image, well, let's pick on the Argo CD image here, has these vulnerabilities in it. But then the nice thing about this is if I'm tracking a specific vulnerability, right? Like I'm worried specifically about this malicious containers can delete any file from the node CVE. I should be able to, I believe, click on that. It'll take me to MITRE. That's not what I'm looking for. If we go to all vulnerabilities and we search for CVE, let's pick a 2023 one, shall we? Out of bounds read. We can click on that and see all of the places in our clusters where this might be affected. Or what, it's present anywhere across our clusters. And so there's a lot of different ways to sort of slice this information. And since it is an action item, right, if we go back to the action item table and we filter specifically down to the trivia report, or actually it's right on top here, because this is an action item, we can route it and group it the exact same way we do the efficiency action items. And so we have sort of that same level of power with the automation rules and the CI/CD integration to surface this information right away.
Neat, neat. And what about policies? What does that do? Do you actually define the kind of cluster you want to config and all of that, or does policy do something else?
So the policy tab is where we view essentially all the policies that generate all action items. So we have a good portion of the built-in ones. So like Polaris, we have all the built-in checks associated with it. We see, a description. We always give remediation advice so that we have context around that. But then here we also start to see our custom policies. So in this cluster, I have a handful of OPA policies. And here is also where we could edit those policies. So we see this one's called CPU limit too high. It's a custom configuration. I can go here and edit this directly. This is actually managed as code. And then we have an uploader that sort of syncs this to our infrastructure as code repository. But this is where we can view all the different policies and all the information about them in the cluster. So we see what category they end up in, how we have it set. So every policy or every action item that we generate has a severity, but then we also have the 3 different places where we check that policy. And so we can configure, we can customize the configuration to say this particular thing, this CPU limit too high policy, should always block in CI and it should always block at admission time. and then it will warn if it pops up in the cluster. But we can configure that for each individual policy. And so the policy view is really to view all of these policies across all the different and all the configuration for all those policies.
Really neat. So yeah, I see that, there's a lot of intelligence baked into it. There's automation, and there's a lot of control as well through the policies. So yeah, really neat. There's a lot that you can actually do with the product, and a lot of use cases. So yeah, I see what you were saying when you started out, saying that there are a lot of different things you can do, but then you kind of had to focus it on cost reduction. But I see that there's quite a few things. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the goal here really, like, ultimately it is the ultimate tool for a platform engineer who wants to build a secure by default and efficient Kubernetes platform and enable their developers to help them do that. And that's what our most successful customers are doing, is they've, migrated to Kubernetes with this, sometimes in place up front. And so they have policies enforced from day one, and they're using all the other features as well. So
Wow. Yeah, thanks. That was a really neat walkthrough. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted to ask about this idea of um, Fairwinds actually reducing the load on platform teams and sort of acting like a help desk of sorts. Could you talk a bit about that? How does that work, and what does it mean day to day?
yeah, yeah. I mean, a little bit of that's marketing messaging, right? I'll be honest. So we find that a lot of times when you're running Kubernetes, what you end up doing is spending most of your time, instead of building a platform and adding functionality to that platform and or securing that platform, what you do is end up teaching developers how to use Kubernetes. And there's going to be some level of that, right? We can't get away from teaching developers how to use Kubernetes. It's a complex learning curve. There's a lot to learn, and we're not all going to get out of learning all of it. But by building a happy path for our developers and enforcing that and giving them the proper feedback mechanisms, like I've been talking about, I think we reduce the amount of time that you have to spend. That plus the amount of baked in remediation advice for all the different action items and links out to different documentation and places like that, it makes it so that you sort of have a place to go for Kubernetes knowledge. You have your, sort of minimal knowledge base here. And then if Insights doesn't have the information, then you go to your platform team. So it's step one, whereas the platform team may have been step one in the beginning.
Neat. And I want to ask about open source, because I saw you mentioned quite a few open source projects that you guys have built. Polaris, one of them, Pluto, and a couple of others. Yeah, so it sounds like Fairwinds is really big on open source, and it's really part of your product strategy. Could you talk a bit about just these open source tools that you built and how they work with the product itself, and what's the significance of your open source projects?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the nice thing about our open source is it's where we start. It's where we came from. We were running clusters and we were building open source tools just to make our lives easier, make our customers' lives easier. And it was that realization that got us into the SaaS business. But really, open source is our DNA from the beginning. One of our earliest projects, RBAC Manager, which was actually really shortly before I even started at the company, it one of our SREs at the time, Rob Scott, who you may be familiar with through the Gateway API project at Google, he saw that it was really difficult to wrap your head around RBAC bindings, right? Because you've got your cluster role bindings, your role bindings, your cluster roles, and your roles, and they all kind of map together in interesting ways. And so what he did was he wrote a CRD that said, let's simplify this a little. You really just want to say, this service account has this policy in this namespace. Well, let's create a CRD around that. And what it does is it manages your role bindings and cluster role bindings to make all of that happen. And it just simplifies your RBAC a little bit. So that was our earliest tool. And I think the next one after that we really talk about a lot is Goldilocks. So I was working with our customers. And this was 5 years ago at this point. I think this was long before a lot of the things that we have today. And we would tell our customers, you have to set your resource requests and limits because you're causing all of these issues in the cluster because we're overloading nodes and we're, seeing kills in random spots, unexpected places because the system's using up all the memory. And they would naturally come back to us and say, well, what do I set them to? And we would go, oh, okay, well, let's go look at a Datadog dashboard for the next hour and we'll give you some recommendations on how to set these things and come back to them. And I said, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And so I went looking around and I was like, I don't really want to write a recommendation engine because I'm not a developer. I'm an SRE. I'm helping people use Kubernetes. I don't have time to go develop a recommendation engine. And so I stumbled on the VPA project and I was like, hey, this recommendation engine actually looks really useful. I don't know that, at the time I wasn't in love with setting resource requests automatically via the VPA, partly because it doesn't work directly with HPAs in some cases and things like that. So, but I said this recommendation piece is really valuable. And so we took that, created a controller that creates a bunch of VPA objects for you, and then puts a dashboard up. It says, here's all your workloads. Here's a recommendation for CPU memory. Fairly simple idea, but it's proven to be extremely popular and folks really like it. And so when we built Insights and we wanted to start surfacing those types of recommendations, the first place we started was with Goldilocks. And so Goldilocks was feeding data into Insights. We've since moved on to more granular data in Prometheus so that we can get exact matches to your cost and billing reports and things like that. But we do still have Goldilocks in the product and we're able to use it. So that was the second big project, I think, and one of our biggest still. And then we have Polaris, our policy engine. At the time when we wrote Polaris, there really was there was OPA, and it was in the early days of OPA, and we all complain about writing Rego. I've actually come to love Rego personally, but it's been a long journey to get there. And so we wrote a simpler policy engine based on JSON schema that let you write admission controller policies for your clusters. And again, you saw that in the product today as well. And it's for a single cluster or even, multiple clusters. There's a dashboard for Polaris. It's still independently maintained and folks can use that with or without Insights. And then the last one I'll talk about is my favorite one, which is one of my favorites, which is Pluto. We were upgrading Kubernetes from 1.15 to 1.16 for all of our customers. And in 1.16, if you don't remember or we don't remember it, there were 6 or 7 APIs that were removed from the API. And it was one of the first large API removals in Kubernetes. And it was some very commonly used ones. It was the deployments extensions v1 beta 1, which goes way back, and it was being removed from the API. And so you had to make sure you weren't using it anywhere. And we were like, well, why don't we just ask the cluster? And well, the cluster very intelligently does API translation and lies to you about what version you deployed. And we went, well, that's a problem. How do we fix this? At the time, all of our customers were deploying with Helm. And so we wrote Pluto to go look at all the Helm releases and find deprecated versions. And on the face of it, very simple tool, and has proven to be extremely invaluable to us and our customers while doing cluster upgrades. Especially if you use Helm. It also works on your, YAML manifests if you're doing a GitOps pattern. And so that's Pluto, and it feeds directly into the product as well, creates action items, tells you when you have deprecated APIs, integrates with our admission controller, and has all those same routing mechanisms and things in the product that I talked about earlier. So that's probably one of my favorite. I'm a little biased because I help write it, but
Really neat. Wow. That's quite a variety of products and going back quite a long way. So really cool that you got to share all of the backstory behind each of these tools. Really cool.
yeah, it's been a fun
How
journey.
many how many stars does Polaris have or Goldilocks approximately?
Good question. I'll tell you in a second because I don't actually know off the top of my head. I haven't kept track in a while. Goldilocks has 2.1 thousand. And Polaris is 3,000.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, and maybe more popular then. Yeah.
Yeah, Polaris I think got a lot of energy when we first released it, because it was kind of the only non-Rego policy engine at the time. I'll say I think Caverno has greatly surpassed us, and I love the Caverno project as well. We use it a little bit. Some of our customers use it, and actually I'm on the policy working group with Jim from Nirmata, and we work well together. So I think they made a great product there as well.
Oh, yeah, I just spoke to Jim 3, 4 days ago. So yeah,
Did you?
amazing.
Great.
He was the last guest on the podcast.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I want to ask about as you wind down, as people. By the way, yeah, Fairwind. So in terms of integration, where does it integrate with, like, where does your Kubernetes cluster need to be for it to integrate, or does it integrate almost anywhere? Any restrictions at all?
Just about anywhere you can run Kubernetes, you can run Insights. We try as a general philosophy to keep all of our tooling as cloud provider agnostic as possible. We do have a few more features in AWS with regard to specifically to billing. So we have a direct billing integration with AWS. We're working on a GCP billing integration. But other than direct cost integration or billing integration, because that has to be cloud provider specific, we try to be as Kubernetes native as possible. So I believe we've even been known to run on OpenShift. It's not easy, but it works.
Okay, all right. I want to ask, as we wind down, so for your customers who come to Fairwinds from probably not using any cost reduction tools or anything of that sort, when they come to Fairwinds, they start using it the first day, first week, first month. What are some of the first results that they get to see? What gets them excited?
I mean, what gets the big companies really excited when they deploy Insights for the first time across all their clusters is when they see they can save thousands to tens of thousands of dollars in their cluster just by right sizing all of their workloads, which is a huge, eye opener for a lot of folks, just not realizing just how over provisioned you are. So I think that's probably the most fun one when we get to install in a big environment and that number just starts to grow and grow. It's like, wow, this has a lot of potential.
Neat, neat. Yeah, and then there's just so much more beyond that as well. There's just so much more to explore in the product. That's a really cool part, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to ask about, as you look ahead the next year or so, what do you see down the road for Insights, for Fairwinds, for some of the open source projects? What excites you most? Where do you see yourselves focusing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that I'm working on slowly. And this is very very early stages, but we will be doing some sort of automated right sizing next year. So we will definitely be enabling folks to use primarily open source along with Insights to automatically right size workloads without having to set resource requests and limits, and hopefully in a safe and opt-in only way. Not hopefully, definitely in a safe and opt-in only way, such that even some of our customers, I'm hoping, will be willing to run this in parts of their production environment. So automated right sizing is a big target for me.
Mhm. Yeah. Would AI play any part at all in all of this, or is that still a long way in the future?
TBD, TBD. Right now what I'm working with is our current recommendation engine in Insights. I think it does a really good job at the moment of producing recommendations. I'd have to defer to our other head of development, Robert. He's kind of our AI ML guy. That's his deal. So we might come
Mhm.
up with something there, but nothing in the works just yet.
All right, cool. Okay, so yeah, that brings us to the end of our conversation around Fairwinds Insights and all things cost reduction that we just spoke about. It's a fascinating conversation, and I love getting to know kind of the story behind each of the different the open source projects, and just yeah, how you work towards building a unique product in the space. Really cool stuff, and so much that it can do. So that was awesome.
Thank you.
Before you go though, Andy, you've got a couple of questions to get to know you a bit more. So I want to ask, what would be your alternate career path if not for your job in tech?
Oh, that's a great question. I've been thinking about it actually ever since you sent it to me because I'm not sure. But I likely would have ended up a mechanical engineer. If I hadn't done that, I have a very serious passion for baking and cooking, and so there's an off chance I would have ended up running a restaurant somewhere.
Oh, neat,
So.
neat. Wow. Do you have a signature dish that you cook? Anything that you're known for?
In my family, I'm known for a lot of things. I think around the house, my eggs Benedict is pretty famous. So around the family, at least.
All right, all right.
Pretty simple.
Cool, cool. Well, you mentioned your dad's influence on you, get you started, get you interested in tech. But I want to ask anything more that you could share, a specific incident or specific phase of, that's when you actually really got into this and thought you want to really do this for a career, uh, being in tech. Anything of that sort? Take us back a bit.
Yeah, I think honestly, the thing that really solidified my desire to stay in tech was Kubernetes. Because like the advent of Kubernetes was huge for me. It shifted my whole career. And so I think that's probably the defining moment that made me realize I actually loved working in tech. Before that, I knew I wanted to be an engineer from a super young age. I loved, I had Lego robots when I was really young. I loved programming them, but I also loved building them. And so I knew I wanted to be some kind of engineer, but I think it was really Kubernetes that kept me in tech. Before that, it was really, I did a little bit of both here and there. The sysadmin work was fun, but in the situation at the time, extremely stressful and painful and all the things that we all remember from the old days of running data centers for some of us. So anyway, that's probably the defining
Oh,
moment for me was Kubernetes.
neat, neat. Wow. I want to ask, which is the open source tool that you spent the most time with?
Ooh, the most time with probably Goldilocks. That actually,
Right.
so another tidbit I didn't share, I didn't know Golang before I wrote Goldilocks. And so not only was I trying to solve a problem for our customers, but I was like, I need a project to work on to learn Go because I'm a very project-based learner. And so I was like, I'm going to learn Go, I'm going to write a controller, and I'm going to solve this problem for our customers all at once. And so that one took me a lot longer just because I was learning to write Go.
Next one, kind of related, but what would you say is your favorite developer tool or, from an SRE background, anything in terms of infrastructure and your favorite tool?
You know, I'm still to this day a heavy Tmux user, and I love Tmux. I can't use a terminal without Tmux, so I got to lean back on the oldies there. So
All right. Neat, neat. The last one for you, Andy, is what's one hobby or interest you picked up during the pandemic?
yeah, that's a good question. I was thought about this too, and I don't think I picked up any new ones, but I reinvigorated my love of old ones.
All right.
So when I was younger, I did a lot of outdoor stuff with my parents and backpacked a little bit. And so a friend of mine was like, "Hey, do you want to go backpacking?" And I was like, "Sure." I haven't done it in like 10 years at this point, but let's go. And I got into ultralight backpacking, and I've been doing that off and on since the pandemic. So that's probably the only one that really came sort of new during the pandemic.
Wow, nice. Yeah, yeah. A lot of the outdoors. That's great.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah, so it was wonderful talking with you, Andy. Thanks so much for joining us. It was a pleasure and just so many insights that you shared. Really could see your passion for working with these projects, and you have a great way of even explaining it to get us excited about looking into it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been really fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Andy. If you want to know more about Fairwinds and Insights, go and check out their website and a lot of the open source tools that he mentioned on the talk today. Go and play around with them. It'd be great to to have them back once again when they have some more features to talk about. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We'll see you the next time. Have a great day. Bye bye.